Good morning. Can everybody hear me fine? In the back? Okay, wonderful, wonderful. My name is Mike Skip Weiler, and I'm with the Foundation of Restoration, and I want to thank everyone for coming, and I think it's just a great thing that we're able to do this again. We just mentioned that, it's good since we haven't had it, for over, it's been 2 years. So I want to welcome everybody. And a couple of things I want to go over. If you need to use the bathroom, they're outside the door where you come in, right across from the pool. Also, if we could, please do your best to wear masks, social distance, and we'll try to get through this as safely as we can. Also, I want to thank Bob Mueller, who put in a lot of, and I think we ought to give him a hand right off the bat. And we really appreciate it, Bob, all the work you've done, just to let you know that. I have 5 minutes, and it's kind of ironic. A few years ago, I did the Pioneer family, spoke for the Beauvais family, and they told me I had 3 minutes. I said, Barb Bosler, who was in charge of the Pioneer, I said, there's no way that I'm going to be able to speak on the Beauvais family in only 3 minutes. I said, I'm sorry. I think I did it in about 10 or 15 minutes, but today I am going to be brief because it's not, I'm not here to speak, but we have a great list of speakers lined up, and I'm really looking forward to hearing them today. So again, thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next year, and we won't be any glitches or delays or anything that might happen like happened last year. Our first speaker is Sharon Person, a professor emerita at St. Louis Community College in St. Louis, Missouri, where she taught English as a second language for 25 years. In 2007, she received a Master of Arts in History from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She has written extensively and researched even more on French colonial Illinois country. She received, as co-author from the State Historical Society of Missouri, the award for the best book of 2015 for St. Louis Rising, the French regime of Louis Saint-Aug de Bellerive. Sharon previously spoke at our 2016 Joint History Conference with the Center for French Colonial Studies on the topic Illegitimate Children in the Illinois Country, and at our 2019 History Conference, where she presented Pierre Leclerc in St. Genevieve. Please welcome Sharon Person, who will be presenting Marriage Inconstant, Guillaume Pottier drafts a will, and the Louisiana Superior Council rejects it.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks for mentioning the titles of my past presentations. It seems like I've hardly moved on. There may be a quiz, however. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Bob. This is something to put together at these times. This may or may not be the title and may or may not be the book cover of a forthcoming book that I have with Carl Eckberg. Due out sometime in fall 2022 or not. It's moving along through the process, but it's a long process. And what I'm talking about today is about one paragraph in that book. I decided to delve into the story a little bit more deeply and came up with what I'm going to tell you about today. So this does not replace the book, and I will try not to do too much self-promotion here. I also apologize, maybe this isn't the most appropriate topic for 9 o'clock in the morning, but that was Bob's decision. In societies predicated on the principle of legitimacy, adultery was the quintessential subversive act because it threatened to disrupt the orderly transmission of names and fortunes. In 1728, after a decade of marriage and 3 children, Guillaume Pottier claimed that his then pregnant wife, Marie Apachicurata, was an adulteress. The child she was carrying could not be his. That unborn child must be declared a bastard. Neither Marie nor the child should share in the estate that he would leave upon his death. This is a story of a Canadian Frenchman who married an Illinois woman and why that wife, Marie Apachicurata, came to the attention of the Louisiana Superior Council in New Orleans. Their family, in the end, did not prosper. Few at this time did. And I have to say, I'm not really drawn to stories of scandal, but I am endlessly curious about families. And the stories here are consequential illustrations about the implementation of French law, the Coutume de Paris, in the 1720s. 1720s was a great time. This implementation of this law affected all families in all of the 18th century French villages of the Illinois country, including St. Genevieve and St. Louis. So our main guy here, Guillaume Pottier, the unhappy, aggrieved husband, was the son of a royal notary in Montreal, Jean-Baptiste Pottier. And you can see he wrote his name with 2 T's, and then he added an extra T to notaire, just to make it look even. Born in Montreal, Guillaume likely left Montreal around the time his father died, 1711 to 1713. In November 1717, a relative newcomer in Kaskaskia, he served as godfather for a daughter of Jean-Baptiste Pottier and his wife, Françoise Lebrise. And that brings us to what we must discuss. There were 2 Pottiers in Kaskaskia. One was called the older, one was called the younger. And they were not brothers. I believe Jeté, I followed up on his citations, but Jean-Baptiste was older and Guillaume was younger, but they were not brothers. Guillaume Pottier was born at Lachine, outside of Montreal. Son of a royal notary, his father died about 1713. Let's see. Oh, so cool. Nope. Okay. This is the signature of Jean-Baptiste Pottier, and here's Guillaume. That definitely looks like a G. Hope you'll agree with me. This is the only place I found their signatures together. It was the marriage of Joseph Delaunay and Elizabeth Brunet de Bourbonnois. Guillaume was much less prominent, if prominent is even a word I can use, than Jean-Baptiste. Okay. Let me see. So Guillaume likely married Marie around that time, 1717. Marie Apachicurata, whose name means having a little nose, a small nose. They were far from, and I don't know what that means. You had to be there. They were far from Kaskaskia in late spring 1719 when their first child, Marie Marguerite, was born. And spring 1719 was also a turning point in the life of the Illinois country. Here's our famous comment in the Sacramental Register, 1703. The Jesuits and their flock came to the Mechimay River, mostly known as the Kaskaskia River. Okay. For about 2 decades after the settling of Kaskaskia on the banks of the Mechimay River, the Illinois country survived in a kind of political and administrative limbo. The seminarian priests at Cahokia and, more important, the Jesuit fathers at Kaskaskia provided some hierarchical structure for the region. But during the first 2 decades of the 18th century, the Illinois country had no fort, no French troops, no colonial administrators, and no substantial governmental presence. I'll let you gaze on this beautiful map for a moment. This map is from approximately 1734. is not completely accurate, but I think it's a beautiful map, and it really highlights to me how isolated the villages were in that time. So things changed in the spring of 1719 when Commandant Pierre Duguay de Boisbriand arrived at Kaskaskia on behalf of the Company of the Indies with 50, 60 troops and government officials. Gosh, it's fuzzy even here, so when you take a picture of it. Among the features of the new government structure was the Illinois Country Provincial Council, officially brought into existence around 1722, and it was there to settle complaints and charges among the villagers. So there was an Illinois Country Provincial Council, and in New Orleans was the Superior Council. Besides the Commandant Boisbriand, the Provincial Council was made up of first counselor and the clerk of the Company of the Indies. On a demographic note, by the mid-1720s, native wives, some were elite Illinois women, others were manumitted slaves, but native wives had become a minority among the wives of French Illinois villages. So the concept that we have about the number of French Indian or native marriages by the mid-1720s, that was already passed. I spent the last 2 years working on the 1726 census, so I know whereof I speak. And everybody here in the room knows that when I say French, I mean culturally French, could be from France, could be French-Canadian. Okay. So when the priests were the keepers of order, the general practices of French customary law regarding families seem to have been followed. Customary law defined is a legal practice of which the people approve, which is introduced by their tacit consent, and which is observed over a considerable period of time. I think that's really interesting. After I put that in, I thought, gosh, almost none of that applies to the Illinois country. It was kind of bumpy. The consent was maybe slow in coming, and of course it had not been a considerable period of time in the Illinois country. Again, in France, there were different legal practices in different parts of the country, but the Coutume de Paris had been declared the law for Canada in 1664, and thereafter in the new colony of Louisiana. Following it meant generally, this particular page here is about the community property regime set up when a husband and wife married. Everything that they acquired together during the marriage was part of the marital community, both what was called movable property and real estate or immovables. So following it meant that when a spouse died, the couple's property was inventoried, made a list, and divided 50-50 based on the value. Between the survivor and the couple's children. The 50% that went to the children was divided absolutely equally among all of the children, regardless of whether they were boys or girls, regardless of age. Everybody got an equal share. If the children were minors, this was essentially a paper exercise, but a vital one, a record for safeguarding the children's inheritance if the surviving parent remarried, which during this period they all did. So it was the summer and fall of 1723 that the consequences of the priests yielding their authority in the manner of a state succession to the new government really came to the fore. It's an exciting time to go back and read the documents, which of course we can do because of Lori and Margaret's work. Thank you. So the summer and fall of 1723, the consequences of this change really became apparent. Estates would henceforth be handled by an official notary and other officials as each case warranted. Before the notaries arrived, the priests would write things down, and we have a lovely tale of a document that a priest was supposed to have, I believe it was in 1728. And the priest said, I went and looked and I couldn't find it. So the notaries really performed an important function, not only in the community, but for us. One exasperated husband cried, how could people far away in France possibly understand things in the Illinois country regarding this law? And surely this law could not be so hard, so rigid, to refuse his wishes about how his own property would be distributed after his death. That was not Guillaume Pottier. and the sentiment was there. When the husband in the French native marriage died, and especially if there were no children in that marriage, inheritance matters became really complicated. For as the exasperated husband correctly claimed, things were different in the Illinois country. Through that decade, several cases before the council highlighted the difficulties of regulating succession. The story in our book is pretty much about all of that. A case of an Illinois woman married to 3 Frenchmen in successive marriages who never bore any children and was wealthy. This was a particularly thorny issue, sorting out the estates. So let's get back to the accusations of adultery. A well-known case in summer 1723, Pierre Fafard de Boisjoli of Kaskaskia brought a complaint to the provincial council against his native wife, Marguerite Anskakai, I apologize for my pronunciations, for adultery. The provincial council, which was brand new at that time, declared her guilty on the testimony of 3 witnesses, and the council decision as reparation, Boisjoli would be allowed to shut her away wherever the said sieur shall find appropriate, and she was to remain there for 2 years. Now, normally in France, this might be a convent. Illinois country, no convent. And we don't know exactly what happened. He could take her back if he wished before the 2 years was up, but there's no further record to help us understand what happened. The husband, Boisjoli, went on to become an officer of the militia, and that's a position that requires, community consent. In 1725, another case before we get back to Pottier, Philippe de la Renaudier, whose name might be familiar to you. He was the clerk of the mines for the Company of the Indies. He and his wife, Perrine Pivert, traveled to Louisiana colony from France together. In 1724, so she was not a native, she was not Indian, she was French. In 1724, La Renaudier was out on the Missouri River with Bourgmont as late as November 1724. And in late 1725, Pivert bore a child after an adulterous relationship with a man in the village, whom she named in this declaration that was taken by the priest, Le Boulanger, on December 1st, 1725. This is Perelot's handwriting. He was the prosecutor and wrote the sentence in this document. So the man was named Guillaume Pottier. He was a voyager, not a fur trader, but a voyager between the Illinois country and New Orleans. The prosecutor sentenced Pottier to pay the damages for the scandal. Use the word scandal. 3,000 livres to the aggrieved husband, which is a huge amount of money. Could build a house with that, and then some. And he was a voyager. So 3,000 livres to the aggrieved husband and 300 to the church. And the council reserved the right, it said in this document, to sentence Pivert as it thought appropriate, but there was no sentence in this document and no other document that confirmed there ever was a sentence for her. Mirroring paternity cases in France, the council required Liberge, the accused father, to take responsibility for the child, to feed and raise him, though it's not clear that any steps toward this happened before the child died at the age of 6 weeks. And his burial record is very interesting. He was not called an illegitimate child. He was not called a bastard. He was noted a natural child of Perrine Pivert, the mother's name, no father in the record. Now, those of us who do genealogy of this time period know that when a child is designated as natural, it generally means that the parents could have married, but they did not. And I think we have to reassess that a little bit. That was not the case for Antoine. He was not, his parents could not have married. Perrine Pivert was the wife of La Renaudier. But if he had lived, he would not suffer the legal implications of illegitimacy, again, meaning he could not inherit anything. Pierre Aubuchon and Francois Vallée, Père, here in St. Genevieve, each had a natural daughter. And they inherited and had good marriages and marriage contracts. This was an earlier one, Catherine Bechet in 1719. This record just says the daughter of Catherine Bechet, the father is unknown, is baptized, has a godmother, and godfather. Oh, there's Charles DeLue. Okay, that's good. So the word illegitimate does not appear. The word natural does not appear. Catherine Bichet was a married woman, so it was noted in several places that her husband was often in New Orleans, but we don't know more about this. This is the entry on the 1726 census. The middle one here is Pottier le Jeune with his wife and one child, and Renaudier was his neighbor, his wife and two children in the 1726 census, which was probably 1724, but that's another story. So here are our, I always want to revert to German when I'm at a loss for words. Anyway, here are our people. Guillaume Pottier and Marie Apachigurata. 1719 was their first child, Marie Marguerite. 1721, Guillaume Pottier fils. 1724, Marguerite, and 1727 or 28, you can see Charles has an asterisk. What I love about this record, this is Marie Marguerite was born in 1719. She was baptized in 1720. This is the priest Guilleminot, who almost does not appear in records. And he has Marie Apachigurata's name spelled exactly correctly. And I think that's pretty amazing. Again, so Marie Apachigurata was one of the Illinois Indian women who adopted the Catholic religion, like Marie Rouenza and Marguerite. I have to pause a moment. Wasekamukwe. And her name translates to Dawn's Light Woman. She is the main figure in the upcoming book. So this couple had two daughters. Neither one survived infancy. Only the child, Guillaume. So there was one child on the census. It was Guillaume fils. Okay. And Dawn's Light Woman actually was his godmother. The circumstances surrounding Pottier's accusation against his wife and the community's response to the pregnancy, we don't know directly. But from the other cases, you can see elements that might have existed. A complaint by the husband to the provincial council, depositions by witnesses, a declaration by Marie to the priest. We have evidence of none of these in this case. Either we have gaping holes in the documentary record, always a possibility, or something else was afoot. The sequence of events in late 1728 is critical but hard to pin down. Marie's child was born after Pottier's will was written in maybe late October, but before November 11th, 1728, when we first see the child's name. Again, he was baptized Charles. There's no extant baptismal record for anybody from these years. And Charles Legardeur de Lille may have been his godfather because he appears in the register about them. So I'm really not good with that, I apologize. After Guillaume's death, the administrators conducted the estate inventory and partition on November 11th in the customary way of the customary law. They allotted half to the widow, Marie, and the other half was divided equally between the two boys, Guillaume fils and the newborn Charles. Joseph Delaunay, who you may remember from the marriage contract, was Guillaume Pottier's friend. He was supposed to represent the interests of the firstborn son, Guillaume Jr., and he was at the estate partition. His name is there, and he must have been horrified as he saw the estate partition go forward, completely ignoring his friend's wishes. Delaunay must have immediately taken off for New Orleans to lodge Pottier's complaint with the Superior Council there, which was registered on December 8th. I get into all the details about the timeline, but okay. This is New Orleans about 1725. So Pottier's will that was conveyed to the Superior Council at New Orleans has not survived, but several accounts of what was in it have survived. The form of the will was not contested, so that was not the problem. Pottier had the correct clauses, the right witnesses. Surely he named his executor. Perhaps he enumerated the debts owed to and by the estate. Maybe he mentioned his family back in Canada. But above all, his expressed intentions in the will were first to exclude his adulterous wife, Marie Apachigurata, from any share in the estate, that massive property that had been accumulating for 10 years since they got married. She was to receive none of it. Second, Pottier also wanted to have the yet unborn child, unborn at the time he wrote the will, legally declared a bastard. And third, Pottier's friend, Joseph Delaunay, was to become the financial guardian of Guillaume Jr., who was just 7 years old. None of these things happened. Delaunay died several months later, but the Superior Council particularly and explicitly rejected the request to declare the unborn child a bastard. In fact, quite the opposite. In their decision, the council declared the child Marie would bear should be considered legitimate. Not a natural child, not father unknown, but actually legitimate. And their explanation was that the child was born during the legal marriage to Pottier, during the messiness of a marriage, during a chaotic marriage, which I call during marriage. This suggests to me that Pottier possibly did not have any witnesses. The witnesses told different stories about what they knew about Marie, and there was no declaration from a priest. No declaration by Marie to a priest about who the father was. Possibly those who knew, and surely somebody knew, remained silent. It's also possible that Delaunay admitted to the council that Pottier had already died, and that surely weakened his case. But by declaring the child legitimate, the Superior Council not only preserved, they actually created rights for this child, a blameless child. Protecting the child's interest was not inconsistent with practice in France. Perhaps the Louisiana Superior Council saw the declaration of legitimacy as a way to repair the disruption, the damage that Marie's alleged actions and this chaotic marriage had caused. At that very time, however, the council was already wrestling with what to do about native wives and estates. So while they protected the child, they devised a penalty for Marie's behavior that reflected what they were already talking about. Marie would not inherit half of the estate for lifetime use, the typical provision, but we would be allowed only 1/3 in the form of a pension, which Delaunay was supposed to administer. Again, he died. Normally, such maintenance sums came by leasing wholesale agricultural enterprises, buildings, fields, slaves, equipment, and livestock. A further condition of the penalty was that Marie had to stay among the French. If Marie left the French village to live among the sauvages, she would be completely cut off from even this pension. Two things to say about the parts of the Superior Council decision regarding Marie. First, the pension was a reduction of a widow's benefit from the estate. And here I'm arguing with historians who have written about this. So the pension was a reduction of the estate, not a complete elimination, with a corresponding increase to the two sons. But you have to understand that under the coutume, no surviving spouse ever, when there were children, ever had complete control of the estate, could never dispose of or alienate the goods of an estate. The property fundamentally had to be preserved for the children. Second condition, more important, that Marie could not return to the native village to live if she wanted to keep the pension. The imposition of serious enough consequences to prevent that from happening reminds us of the famous 1725 will of the famous Marie Rouenza, in which she disinherited the son who had married a native woman and moved to his wife's village, the Kaskaskia village, against his mother's wishes. Though Rouenza's provision of the will and its codicil express a mother's chagrin at her son's choices, I won't make a comment there, and it also reflected the fervency of her membership in the French Catholic community. It also mirrors the trend and the will of the Superior Council, French administrators at this time in both the Illinois country and New Orleans. And this, you can see in the records, range from concern to downright panic that scarce farm implements, livestock, material goods, not to mention slaves, might leave the French villages altogether through inheritance practices and end up in the hands of the native Illinois. The argument about which natives could inherit and which could not under French law was a very live argument and is dealt with further in the book. But this concern that things just might disappear also suggests that native wives moved easily back and forth between the two villages, and that this movement had advantages for the French. In fact, sometimes sustaining that complicated relationship between the French and their Illinois neighbors was surely more important than the decisions of the faraway Superior Council in New Orleans. And one comment in one of the records I find kind of amusing was that the Illinois in their village were well aware of what the French law on inheritance was, and they knew that as relatives of a wife who died, or a widow in particular who died, they might put some claim to the goods of the estate. So Marie did not leave the French village. She did not allow her son's estate to dissipate. She remarried Raymond Canal, a Canadian. When she married him, the two Pottier boys came into the new household. You can see that in the 1732 census. Marie also now had a larger extended French family in the Illinois country. With her new husband, she bore a daughter, a half-sister to the Pottier boys. Good moment for a break. Moving towards the end of this part of the story. The legitimization of Charles, decided by the Louisiana Superior Council and supported by the Kaskaskia community, endured for his lifetime. Fate decreed that the lifetime of the favored son was shorter. Guillaume Pottier Jr. died in February 1748 at age 27, and it's clear from the records he was preceded in death by his mother, Marie. Take a moment to appreciate her, Marie Apachicurata, a native wife of two successive French-Canadian Illinois countrymen. She remained resident in the Catholic French community all her adult life, and maybe that wasn't always easy. She maneuvered successfully through the changing Illinois country society. She bore at least 5 children. She survived accusations of adultery, serious accusations, and saw a son who was perhaps the product of an illicit liaison legitimized by the highest law court in Louisiana. All of this speaks volumes about Marie's persistence and self-possession, but it also says a little bit about French colonial Kaskaskia, its diversity, its tolerance, its sense of fair play. So Guillaume Jr. died 1748, 20 years after the original death of his father and the original estate division. So his estate devolved to his half-sister and to Charles Pottier, who in this document here in 1748 was called Brother Germain. In other words, had the same parents as Guillaume. Who knows if that was true or not. But 20 years later, that decision by the Superior Council held. The notary carefully recorded that the only property that there was to divide between these two half-siblings was what Guillaume had inherited from his mother. The rest had quickly dwindled, leaving only enough to cover his debts. The estate of Guillaume Pottier Jr., essentially his share of the estate of Marie Apachicurata, was divided 50-50 between those two siblings, Marie-Louise Canal and Charles Pottier. For several years after his brother's death, Charles appears in various records related to his guardianship and the rent or sale of the property he inherited, but we don't know when or how his own life ended. He may have migrated across the river to St. Genevieve with his half-sister. She married Etienne Gouvreau. Julie Hardwick is a historian of 17th and 18th century France. She spends a lot of times in archives over there. I'm so jealous. She's a tenacious reader of archived manuscripts. She spent years analyzing archives in Lyon. And her conclusion when studying premarital pregnancies and the problems they cause was that there was community participation to move toward resolutions that served to mitigate disruption of order, sought ways to restore reputations, sought ways to control men's sexual behavior, and to do the least harm to a child born out of wedlock. This community network, comprised of family, neighbors, priests, midwives, courts, all worked together not to punish. This was not the tendency. Not to punish, but to work things out in the spirit of pastoral care. She noted significantly that sometimes that care took the form of silence, and the documentary absence of a satisfying conclusion might mean that things were settled out of court. Such motives and actions that she wrote about in France surely could have happened in an Illinois country. And when you read notarial documents, you often feel they're the end point of some interactions and negotiations. The grandson of Marie Apicicurata was born about 1750, Raymond Gauvreau, son of Etienne and Marie-Louise Canal. As a young man, he lived in St. Genevieve, most likely with one of his Gauvreau or LaCroix relatives. The sole third-generation member of Marie Apicicurata's family was made very poor by France's loss in the French and Indian War. But that's a story for another time. Maybe next time I won't talk about illegitimate children so much. But this is not what I wanted to say about St. Genevieve. So we're going back to 1728. The story of the Pottier family intertwines with that of another family. Back in 1728, the inventory and division of Guillaume Pottier's estate, the father, 2 slaves were mentioned. You can see the document there on the left. That's why I wear reading glasses, and I can recommend some really good eye drops. 2 slaves were mentioned. One, a black male farm worker whose name we never learned from the records was apportioned to the widow in her part of the estate. This is not the whole estate, just the most valuable things. This slave was sold in 1739 to the children's guardian. Most likely that meant that Marie had died, because a family like this would not sell slaves except at some important transitional point in the family. The other slave was apportioned to Charles, the legitimized son. You notice that Guillaume did not inherit a slave. He had the horse mill and 2 horses, which pretty quickly were sold. This was the second slave was a native girl. From, I hate to say things like this, from the valuation she was given in the estate, it's clear that she was very young, probably under 10. We don't know where she came from. Let me see. When Charles turned 14, the farmland he inherited plus the livestock and this enslaved, now a young woman when Charles was 14, were rented out in order to generate some income for Charles' living expenses. And several additional documents for the farm lease exist, and because of these kind of heavy transactions, and because of the priceless assistance of Michael McCafferty at Indiana University, we know her name. Her name was Awa-Pie. And because Michael is a linguist, you know that that is the vocative form of Awa-Pie, which in Algonquian, Illinois means arrow, A-R-R-O-W. Awa-Pie belonged to the estate of Charles Pottier, but it was Charles' guardian, Pierre Aubuchon, who determined her fate. Awa-Pie grew up and bore a daughter around 1745, the father unknown to us. By 1747, Awa-Pie had become ill, unable to do field work or even laundry, and in this condition, she and her daughter were leased to Antoine Aubuchon and released from farm labor. This is the Aubuchon who several years later is one of the first St. Genevieve habitants on the census in 1752. When Antoine Aubuchon died in 1761, his widow, Elizabeth Delaunay, you know that name, was commonly known as the widow Aubuchon. In 1764, a native slave woman in her household gave birth to a son, christened Jean-Baptiste, whose godfather was Louis Saint-Ange de Bellerive. The 1766 census of St. Genevieve shows the Aubuchon household with 2 slaves, and these cannot be other than Awa-Pie's grown daughter and Jean-Baptiste, Awa-Pie's grandson, whom she likely never knew. I hope the names are starting to sound familiar. In September 1767, a second son was born to the slave woman, and in the baptismal record, her name appears Marianne. In the 1770 census of Indian slaves, 3 names appear in the household of the widow Aubuchon: Marianne and Marianne's 2 sons, Jean-Baptiste and Louis. You, the keepers of St. Genevieve stories, know these names: the widow Aubuchon, Marianne, Jean-Baptiste, and Louis. Marianne, the sincere Catholic and enslaved woman who knew Kaskaskia and its slave inhabitants well enough that in March 1773, when she crossed the river with Celadon and a party of partiers, during that weekend she negotiated to get a packet of seeds to a slave of a British captain. You know the rest of the story, right? you know the rest of the story. If you don't know the rest of the story, there's a book. So Marianne, the daughter of an enslaved woman, a slave herself, bore 2 sons into slavery, 3 generations of one slave family, such as they were, in the Illinois country. Marianne broke the middle link and stole herself away from captivity in 1773, running away with Celadon, never to return. Our Pierre, Marianne, Jean-Baptiste, and Louis belong to the history of the Illinois country, to Kaskaskia and to St. Genevieve. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, slaves lived and endured through the transformations in the Illinois country as much as any of the elite Illinois women, French husbands, families. Families on the margins, they were slave, they were poor. We need to listen carefully and patiently and research relentlessly to hear their stories. Just a reminder. I thought this was my rest stop on the Lachine Road, surely between Montreal and Lachine. I love this illustration, which I borrowed from the recent book on the seminarians. A big thanks, of course, as always, to Carl Eckberg and to Margaret and Lori for their work, without which none of this would be possible. Thank you.